Hello, welcome to Chile Talk. I'm Neil Davidson. I'm with Pete Lee, of course, and the big day has been and gone where the Chilean Constitutional Convention delivered its text for the nation to consider and either accept or reject in 2 months' time. And so we're going to just have a quick look at that. So Pete, big kind of ceremony. And then a text which we've eagerly studied, particularly you. And what do you make of it? It looks a bit like a draft in some ways to me. They seem to repeat things so many times about rights and this and how human rights are paramount. And then in case you've forgotten, they say it again like a paragraph later.
Yes, well, we're down to 388 articles from 499. The text is considerably shorter than it had been. There is this almost catechism. Is that the right word?
That is exactly the right word. If you're going to say what I think you are.
In the text, it has a kind of cant about it that is repeated with different threads. Part of the process that was called harmonization of the text involved taking some of the repetition out, but there's quite a bit of repetition remaining. And in some respects, you can look at this constitution and say, well, there are still so many articles in it that there sort of is something for everyone. It's a bit like when Boris Johnson had his Get Brexit Done election, and he added in something about let's do something for the animals. And this, of course, because his girlfriend at the time is a big animal rights fan. And pretty much there are bits and pieces like that for such things as animal sentience and animal rights and sexual.
So on the one hand, on the one hand, it's kind of like a piece of music where certain themes leitmotifs keep coming back in for musical effect more than anything else. And on the other, it's a kind of rag bag as well, kind of last night of the proms, sort of keep a certain crowd happy. And who's that crowd then? So the crowd that's been kept happy here is clearly not a kind of very right-wing crowd.
No, I mean, the basic criticism would be that this is pitched towards certain sort of sectarian identities. That would be a criticism. And in reality, the bits and pieces of acknowledgement for different diversities, for example, original peoples and nations, has a combination of a very dignified quality about it and perhaps some possibly actionable problems such as Indigenous land rights that are not very well defined and hard to understand, restrictions on the possibility of the state to access lands earmarked to Indigenous groups. But even that, I would not say is the greatest problem with the document. The greatest
Even though
problem,
it could start enormous problems if people understand these provisions differently. I mean, anything could happen really. I mean, a sort of Catalonian independence referendum situation could, I don't know, anything could happen. Any scenario is thinkable, isn't it? But anyway, so go on.
It's hard to foresee, yes, but the biggest problem is simply the system of government. The overall system of government is not clearly in communion with any healthy tradition of government in Chile, and we see a leaching out of checks and balances in this.
Bearing in mind that Chile, despite Pinochet, does have this tradition and is recognized as having this tradition of a kind of certain talent for governance and for checks and balances and for having actually a working state.
Yes, certainly by Latin American standards, a phrase we like to use a bit on Chile Talk. And as a result, people who read this text will certainly generally come out of it with some grave concerns about big problems with the text and a range of responses to the more minor bits and pieces, which of course are very important for the particular groups that they're pitched towards. And we see more and more centrists disendorsing approval of.
Okay, just remind us very quickly of the kind of just real bullet points of these big problems it will create in the way the country's governed. I mean, one is the Senate, right? Another's kind of the judiciary. Perhaps you could just quickly sort of just very quickly give the bullet points here.
Yes, well, the Senate will be abolished and replaced by really a chamber of the regions, which sounds a bit like a Senate in some traditions, but would not have full veto powers over lower house lawmaking. And yes, the judiciary will have, well, a very devolved role. For example, there'll be potentially indigenous systems of justice that on a discretionary
competing
basis,
somehow with the Chilean,
and any concept of the very important constitutional judges interpreting the Constitution will be considerably diluted in this scenario. So
it's a weakening. It's a weakening of the kind of independence and power of the judiciary, essentially.
Yes, the division of the powers of the state, and there's the possibility of the concentration of power through the lower house in a particular group that will then be able to perpetuate its power one way or another. So those grave concerns are disturbing to a lot of the centrists who perhaps at the start of the year you would be assuming would at the very least be endorsing the document in a lukewarm way or a lesser of two evils way. A lot of those people, the people I like to see as sort of the Fabian centre in British terms, you know, with social democratic tendencies, are opting to come out for rechazo, for rejecting the new document. Of course, with a lot of emphasis on the need to immediately reform the constitutional law that there is in some pretty thoroughgoing ways without turfing out all of constitutional tradition to the extent that the new draft would do.
Now, one person who intervened was Ricardo Lagos, former president, and he said, you know, if the constitution is rejected, this new constitution, then, you know, we shouldn't throw all their work out the window. We should start again, get something better, incorporating the good things, which are the rights of, you know, this and that, and minorities, and lots of good things, you know, the social responsibility of the state. And if it's rejected, if it's accepted, then we must immediately set about reforming it. I don't understand this. Surely if it's accepted, it's accepted. How can you then immediately reopen it? Is that actually a provision that's made in the way the whole thing's set up?
Well, the Congress will still have the ability to reform the laws, and there is a transitional period in which the Congress potentially can fairly thoroughly reconsider and vote on certain aspects, the pre-constitutionality, if you like, of elements of the document. From what we're getting from the opinion polling, a very low number of people are voting to approve the Constitution in the expectation that it will be implemented in its current form, around 10%, and another getting on for 30% would like to approve it on the basis of immediate reforms. A similar situation is in place for the Reject scenario. Reject there's a hard core of perhaps almost 20% of the population that simply wants to continue with the existing constitution, but there's more people who would like to see really a reform of the constitutional tradition, and a new constitution anyway, produced by personnel other than the members of the convention.
Now, you're not, I think it's safe to say, a huge fan of some of the personalities that have, come to public notice in the convention. And we've mentioned before that it seems to be rather self-referential, the whole thing, and they seem to be looking more at each other than at the wider world, perhaps.
Well, what most disturbs me about some of the characters is that I assumed that on the 4th of July, when the final version of the draft was delivered, the members of the convention would do the sensible thing, given their lack of popularity, and disappear into the woodwork and have someone else take over advocacy of the document. But that doesn't seem to be the case. They're having a documentary made about their vision, and they're heavily involved with the media and on Twitter. They're having the time of their lives. The general public just doesn't seem to like them very much. I'm sure their fans like them, but they're not winning over the centre. And there are some characters that draw out the ire of the average Chilean. The average Chilean isn't too happy about public monies being wasted in what are often perceived as frivolous activities by the convention, nor in a document of the perceived quality of this document. So yes, that part surprises me. By way of comparison, those advocating different forms of reject, mostly reject and reform, have divided the role reasonably cleanly between people involved in the constitution, of whom there was, only a minority of right-wing and centrist members. There's a division between those characters, although some of them are quite colourful, and those who are advocating for the reject line. In fact, the main reject campaign is based on the idea of a citizenly rejection. So rather than political figures or even too many celebrities, those claiming to represent the citizens in a more authentic and direct way have taken on the role, including, of course, some sort of self-appointed intellectuals. But they seem to be doing a reasonably good job of gathering support for the reject line. So it's looking like a case of the proponents of the new constitution not quite being in touch with the reception of their image by the wider public.
And it's not just their personal image. I mean, it's the whole, this tin air extends to kind of everything. I mean, looking at the constitution, for example, they talk about sexual minorities and sexual dissidents, which is a term that will be instantly recognizable to anybody who's followed the culture wars in the United States. But I think to the average Chilean, this concept is very familiar and actually baffling. And again, similarly, the Constitution contains the idea of nature having rights, which again, it will be enormous news to a lot of people, and it's not even clear what it means. I mean, if you haven't thorough grounding in the whole history of that sort of discussion, I mean, the idea that nature can have rights just seems completely absurd. And possibly is absurd, but I mean, again, there's obviously a whole doctrine has been built up to justify it,
Yes.
and then of course they start off pretty early on as well by saying Chile is un estado solidario. There's no adjective in English corresponding to the noun solidarity, but if there were, Chile is a solidary state, a state governed by solidarity. And again, what does that even mean? If you followed, obviously, if you've got some, knowledge of the subject, then it's kind of opposed to a subsidiary state. But I didn't really know what it means. I know a subsidiary state is when the state kind of basically steps back and lets the lower echelons do their stuff and only steps in when it's necessary, right? So a solidarity state is one, I suppose, where the state, it sounds a bit sinister. I mean, the state basically is in charge of everything, right? I mean, perhaps you know more about this.
Well, this pair of concepts, of course, both stem from Catholic social doctrine. Interestingly, one of the most interesting, I say the word interesting a lot on Chile Talk, by the way, one of the most interesting commentators on the fall of the Allende regime in 1973, the Frenchman Alain Turan, who was married to a Chilean and holidaying in Chile at the time of Allende's downfall, went on to also study the Solidarity movement in Poland, which of course was also heavily influenced by Catholic social doctrine. And I think, there is this classic question from the now saint Alberto Hurtado: is Chile a Catholic country? And Chile, to me, seems to be such a profoundly Catholic country that it can hit upon ideas such as solidaritarian state, even when attempting an entirely laicist rejigging of the constitutional tradition.
That's right. And I think also the concepts of subsidiarity, obviously it goes back much further, but as understood is also, it goes back to some encyclical, I think, of Pope Leo the 14th in the 1890s or something.
1891, yes. New thing,
so,
yes.
So both sides of the argument, it seemed to, as understood in Chile, it seemed to go back to it's the Catholic Church arguing with itself, essentially, between subsidiarity and solidarity. Yeah, I mean, because when, I remember when in the European Union, there was this big thing of subsidiarity after there was the Maastricht Treaty, wasn't it? I get mixed up, but it was kind of formally said that the European Union would have this doctrine of subsidiarity, and meaning, in other words, what the national states could do best would be left to them, etc. And we in Britain, just assume basically the word had just been made up, to sort of express something that needed to be expressed. We didn't know about this whole continental Catholic tradition, that lay behind it.
Of course, it was an echo of the Treaty of Westphalia as well, and the accommodations of the ecumenical structure, if you like, of Catholicism, what came out of Catholicism through the Reformation. So, yes, I think to antinomian Anglos, it's completely inscrutable, but it would seem to be a concept that's very attractive in some cultural traditions, and it does
really is in the veins, yeah.
Yeah, which is interesting. So we have this urge to bring the society together somehow in essentially a religious manner. One person who may be actually benefiting in a fairly perverse manner from the situation that we're now in with 2 months to go prior to the plebiscite, is actually the president. Now, the president, Gabriel Boric, his approval rating seems to track the fall of approval for the Constitution. But he's just now starting to prepare for the possibility that the document won't be approved. Of course, after he and his proxies had said that it was absolutely essential to have a new constitution in order to deliver what is rather endearingly called our program. Of course, the government doesn't have a very strong backing in the Congress to deliver its program, and the concept of the government's program is somewhat mysterious, because the program that was put to the electorate in the presidential election was not coherent or balanced in any way, and I don't think was assumed to need to be. It was simply a flavour of tastes and colour and light. Now, Boric has made it clear that he's going to try and unify the country, whatever the result, which I think is a nice thing to say, but it's also a convenient thing for him to say, because at the moment we have so many problems. We have a problem with the price of copper, which of course has partly driven down the peso, but the economic uncertainty that we're under has further exacerbated that situation. There's very little confidence in investing in the country. It's almost inconceivable that the tax take can be increased under these circumstances, regardless.
They want to get an extra 4% of GDP, don't they, to fund some of their program, which includes abolishing all student debt, I think, at a cost of $8 billion. I really haven't heard so much about that lately.
It's very ambitious. But the thing is, obviously, if the document is approved, then Boric will somehow embody a huge paradigmatic change in the society. And even if it's just a bare win for the approve, it does mean something rather profound. He's a winner in that case, but he's possibly also a winner if there's a firm or even slight rejection of the new constitution. And why? Well, because there'll almost certainly then be an uptick in the economy, in confidence, and in a return of Newtonian physics, if you like, to Chilean political climate. We will probably see a ruder recovery in the Chilean economy compared to other places, simply because the country's been brought so unusually low in recent times. And Boric may well find himself overseeing a much more broadly supported process of rewriting the constitution, obviously with greater concessions to the centre and the right than have been evident in the Constitutional Convention, producing a document that Chileans are proud of, and seeing the economy improving over the remaining more than 3 years of his mandate. And he may well be well remembered. We don't know, but it may well be a win for him if we see a rejection.
Interesting take on it. Yeah. Okay, I think on that note, we can wrap it up. Our first reaction to the new constitution, to which we will no doubt return on more than one occasion. Thanks very much for joining us, and hope to see you next time.
Thank you.